Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The aircraft exploded and the cockpit filled with fire. And so you're sitting in fire and you're trying to figure out what just happened. And it's a weird experience. First of all, you're almost punchy because, you all this has happened to you in probably 20 or 30 seconds. And it takes a bit to get your wits about you. But the other thing is it's like sitting in the center of a bonfire. You're literally sitting in a fire. Any skin exposed is burning.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Colonel Robert J. Graham was more than a fighter pilot. He was a leader, a warrior, and a witness to one of the most complex conflicts in modern history. From the chaotic early days of guerrilla warfare in Vietnam to the final bombing mission, Colonel Graham's 4 combat tours revealed the triumphs and tragedies of a war that reshaped his world and his nation. We talk about his book, One of the Few, a true account of courage and stepping into the fight. In vivid detail, you're taken into the cockpit of supersonic jets, the gritty realities of jungle warfare, and the tense moments of life or death decision-making. I'm delighted to welcome Colonel Robert J. Graham to our Cold War conversation.
So the truth of the matter was I was never interested in flying. What happened was I was in college and I dropped out of college. I was an only child and both my parents died. And so I was sort of trying to figure out how I could get through life and support myself and stuff like that. College wasn't a problem. That was all fully paid for with athletics and academics. I couldn't figure out how to buy food and shelter, things like that. So the easy way was to enlist in one of the military services. And I happened to be in Air Force ROTC when I was in college. And so when I dropped out of college, I enlisted in the Air Force. But I'm not sure I knew the front end of the airplane from the back end of the airplane. Never had any interest in flying. However, after I was in the Air Force for a couple of years, I decided that there was a better option to go through flight school and become commissioned. And so I decided that the route to becoming an officer was through the aviation cadet program and through flight school. So I applied for aviation cadets, was accepted as a pilot and as a navigator, and was simply waiting as an enlisted man, a two-striper. I guess about pilot training, I think I would have had to wait 9 or 10 months. For navigator training, it was like 3 months. And so the easy road through flight training was to take navigator training. So I did that first and then flew as a navigator backseater for about 3 years.
And when you do start the training to become a pilot, you're training to fly the F-100 Super Sabre, which is not really renowned as the most easiest aircraft to fly.
But what got me in the flight school as a pilot was I had, after 3 years of flying in the backseat of some of the first jet fighters, why I was going to get out, go back to college, finish college, and go into business or whatever. But we had a stop off. I was flying back from Los Angeles. We stopped over at Las Vegas. And while there, we spent the 2 nights. And the pilot I was with had flown in the Korean War. And so he knew several of the instructor pilots there, some of the Thunderbirds. And after spending 2 nights with him, I decided that when I grew up, what I really want to do is go fly the F-100. I think largely because that combination of being impressed by those guys and a sufficient quantity of beer convinced me that that was my future career. So the F-100 was really important to me. And going through flight school and graduating at the top of my class was really important because that way I got my choice of assignments, one of which was the F-100. And so I was able to continue my career. into the F-100 after flight school.
In the book, there's a line that you have in there, which is you don't fly the plane, you wear the plane. Can you describe what you mean by that?
So when you think about large airplanes, it's a bit like driving a truck where you're really steering the plane around. But when you're flying jet fighters, it's all about the instability of the airplane and learning to think in a three-dimensional capability about the entire big sky. And because your flying is not just take off from point A and land at point B and just fly straight ahead en route, that type of flying is almost fully acrobatic from the time you take off till the time you land. In the fighter environment, you're maneuvering all the time. You're flying close to formation and doing whatever. And so you can't think about flying the airplane. You have to think about you because you're in a glass cockpit. And you just think that, okay, I want to be upside down or right side up or going straight down or going straight up or whatever it happens to be. And then just put yourself there, put your body there. And pretty soon you find that you don't think about an airplane anymore. You just think about where you'd like to be.
Can you remember the first time you flew the F-100 solo? Can you remember that day?
I'm not sure I do. I remember the first couple of times. It was a very, very difficult. The airplane I had come out of was a training airplane. It was very easy to fly. It was a jet, but it wasn't as fast. It wasn't as maneuverable, and it certainly wasn't as unstable as the F-100. But the excitement of the F-100 was I had never been supersonic before that. And so your first ride, and the F-100 got up about maybe Mach 1.25-ish pretty easily. But to go supersonic for the first time in your life, I thought that was really cool. And then the other thing that struck me was how unstable and unforgiving the airplane was. And that takes a little bit of getting used to. So I can't remember the exact flight, but I can remember being impressed for the first couple of flights.
I understand that the attrition rate was quite high in terms of pilots who flew the F-100 because it was quite unforgiving.
Yeah, it was. According to the Air Force statistics, the F-100 was the most dangerous, unforgiving airplane that the Air Force has ever owned, up through and include today. I think the F-100 was in first place, and SPAD from World War I was in second place. So the competition was pretty keen over the years. Our attrition in training at Misawa, Japan, in obviously a peacetime environment, or at least a semi-peacetime environment, was about 20% a year, every year. So if you had a squadron of, let's say, 25, then you could expect to attend 5 funerals every year. Typically, in our case, we had 2 F-100 squadrons there at Misawa, and so you got to attend a funeral every month for one of your friends. When we moved into combat, at the beginning, as we were learning how to stay alive in combat, that went up a little bit. Our unit, I think, was up around 30%-ish. Some of the units got as high as 60%, but we were able to get up around 30, and then it pulled back to about the standard 20. So wow. Someplace on the order of, just to make it easy, 20% a year every year.
Wow.
Not so bad the first year, but after a while that begins to wear on you because the fatality rate. Now that's not the accident rate, that's just the fatality rate. So obviously we were able to get quite a few of the pilots back alive if they were able to eject. So it was an exciting An exciting business.
An exciting business, yeah. Yeah, I think I might use that in the promotional material for this. So, what age were you when you first started flying the F-100?
About 25-ish. Yeah,
Okay.
about 25.
And when you're in Japan, you're being trained for nuclear missions. Can you just describe to me what the nuclear missions were with the F-100?
Yeah. So if you think back then, so let's take beginning 61 is when I first got involved, 1961, in the nuclear mission. Back then, if you remember, the idea was that the Soviets and others, would use nuclear bombs, tactical nuclear bombs, probably as the major deterrent from each other. That was particularly true in Europe. But the targets were from Russia and China in our case. And so for the nuclear deterrent to work and reduce some of the danger between two nuclear powers, it had to be a very real and verifiable threat. And so in our case, because nuclear weapons were not allowed in Japan for obvious reasons. And so in order to have a nuclear deterrent, we had a couple of bases on the western coast of South Korea. And from there, we had targets in both Russia and China. The idea is that in order to have the big bombers like B-52 or whatever penetrate deep into enemy territory, they had to get past the air defenses, and the tactical nuclear weapons were designed to, if you will, blow a hole in the enemy defenses. So if you think about it as a bit of a fence around the country, then your job was to blow holes in that fence so the bombers could penetrate deeper and deeper into the mainland of Russia and China. The issue is that for a fighter airplane, obviously they're always short on fuel, and for us, our targets in China and Russia were one-way rides because you didn't have enough fuel to recover outside of your target area. And so you had to get used to the idea that if somebody decided that, gee, let's go start a nuclear war, that your trip was going to be a one-way trip.
And what did you think you were going to do after you dropped the weapon? Or did you think you were going to be too close to the blast in order to survive?
No, theoretically, we were far enough away from the blast so we could survive. The problem was we couldn't go very far after the blast. So that puts you, floating down in your parachute in enemy territory, and probably not very welcome. It's unlikely that they'd be very hospitable. Theoretically, you could land and hang out and try to make friends and think of a different career. But the one-way trip was just that because you're not going to sit through a nuclear war in a cave in China someplace and expect that to be a successful recovery. So
now, in the book, you describe, while I think you're flying from the base in Korea, an encounter with an aircraft near the DMZ.
Oh, the hot nose story. Okay, so as kind of a humorous trick to play on one another, just to increase our sensitivity, if we could sneak up behind one of our planes and pull up quickly in front of them and frighten them, then that was a good training to say you need to be more alert and more conscious and what's going on behind you. And so typically when we were sitting on a nuclear alert pad, we got one day off a week that we could fly and, do some training and things like that just to keep our hand in. There's one particular day, myself and another fellow in my sister squadron had a day off, and we went out to the gunnery range for about a half hour or so. Now we had some time left over, so we went out and played around with acrobatics and things like that. And the base we were operating out of was very, very close to the DMZ between South Korea and North Korea. And we were out over the water. And when we looked, we saw what we thought to be a South Korean F-86 fighter that was all by himself out there over the water. And so we thought we'd, play a funny trick on him. And we snuck up behind him. We were going, just fractionally under the Mach. And as we passed underneath them in a tight two-ship, why both of us stroked our afterburner just as we passed in front of his nose, and so the surprise and the shock is a memorable experience if it happens to you. And as we're coming under and past him, we realized that it wasn't a South Korean aircraft; it was a North Korean MiG aircraft. So as we passed up in front of the MiG, he became unglued almost. And as we pulled up and over the top of him and looked down, he was flailing around all over the sky, and finally took up and headed north to get back up into North Korea as fast as he could go, which was a funny experience. Now, it was obviously illegal, immoral, and irregular to do that. So we had to be very, very careful on the way back that we didn't mention that little incident with the North Korean, but it was a very, very humorous incident, if that's your sense of humor.
Well, it's okay. Your secret's safe with us, Robert. We won't mention it to anyone. There's so many fascinating incidents you talk about in this book, but one of the other ones I wanted to touch on was this issue with the F-100 with the uncommanded inputs.
Yeah, that is problematic. So, as I recall, the manufacturers were having problems with a flight control system hooked up to an autopilot system. And for whatever reason, gremlins or whatever, you would get these uncommanded inputs. And when that happened, your controls, you would be locked out of your controls in effect. And typically, the aircraft would pitch nose down or up or whatever, but typically nose down. And you had no control inputs manually through the stick or the rudders. So you were kind of along to the ride. You pull every circuit breaker you could find, you hit whatever disconnects you could find, you turn things off, turn things on. And it never seemed to matter, but periodically that would happen. If you were in a bad position, like fast and low, the chances of being killed were pretty high. If you were high enough, 25, 30,000 feet, something like that, it came out of it somehow by itself, then you went back to a normal flight control arrangement where your inputs were controlling the aircraft. But during the period of time where the autopilot system or whatever came in, you were locked out. It was doing whatever autopilots do in that situation. And in most cases, probably in 85% of the cases or 75% of the cases, I would say that you either ejected and or you ran into the ground in the aircraft, depending whether you were low or high or how long it lasted or whatever. So it was a really spooky feeling. Everybody hated it. But I think they finally resolved that problem because years later, going through Vietnam, I don't recall that happening. But when I was at Masala, that was unfortunately, not an uncommon thing.
Yeah, that must be pretty terrifying that something like that can occur at any point and you just can't fix it. Now, did you have any escape and evasion training while you were in Korea?
Our escape or survival training was really extensive. So we had about a 3-week program which taught not only survival. So the first portion of that was, in my case, it was February in the mountains. Snow was about 6-7 feet high. You went in with your flight suit, a knife, and a live rabbit, and you were out there for 7 to 10 days. And that taught you how to, live off the land, if you will. And then after you finished that, they ran you through a replica of a POW prison with interrogation and things like that. And that was an eye-opening experience. And so, but again, that was a 2 or 3 week thing. And then you had shorter periods where you had water survival. Like for us, we went down and did our water survival down in Tokyo Bay. Had Arctic survival, you name it, we got it.
In the book, I was surprised with the mock-up of the prisoner of war camp, how full on the training is. I mean, at one point, I think you're locked in a box.
Yes. So back then, a physical contact was not a surprise to anybody. It is today. It's really interesting when you talk to young people today. The idea of physical contact is really foreign to them. Many people, men anyway, go through life and don't experience that. Back then, it was much more common. Certainly in athletics, it was very, very common. But the rules of the camp were this. They wanted to expose you to, I can't say realism because you can't go that far, but they wanted to expose you to some discomfort in your interrogation training. And so the rules were that they could not break any bones and they could not leave any scars. And anything short of that was okay. And so typically when you were going through interrogation, they always start out by slapping you around a bit or putting you in the box. I'd rather be slapped around than put in a box. That box wasn't very much fun. But things like that. And they were all new experiences. So when you went into the box, it was probably your first experience with serious claustrophobia and serious discomfort. When they started shoveling the dirt in on top of you, that was another brand new psychological experience. But those kinds of things are really important because you're young and you're embarking upon a career where you better get used to being slapped around because it's going to happen a lot. But that was the idea behind it. That was a very, very good program. One of the things that I thought was interesting, in order to get your attention, don't forget it was February in the snow. Why, when they first picked you up, they would have you strip and run naked around a circle in the snow with your hands above your head. And that sounds weird, except that it doesn't take very long until your hands become extraordinarily painful. And so that's an example of the kind of thing where we're not going to leave any scars, we're not going to break anything, but we're certainly going to get your attention. And that was so a very, very, very good training. But it was, for some, it was less comfortable than others.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I can't imagine it actually, really. Now, in 1962, you decide to accept a classified assignment to Vietnam as a civilian advisor. Why did you decide that you wanted to leave the Air Force at that point?
So I was up in a flight one night in the F-100, and I go, long story short, I was apparently having problems with my pitot-static system that I didn't realize. And
the pitot-static system measures the airspeed of the aircraft.
It's coming back to land. Why at Masala. Why I pitched out downwind was fine, but as I started to turn base, the PO-static system began to hang up and the aircraft stalled out, and I went into the trees prior to the runway and tore the airplane up pretty well. It slid up on the runway, so I felt like it was sort of a landing. But anyway, so the aircraft got really beat up, and the part was not so much about the aircraft being torn up. The problem is that our squadron was hoping to get a flight safety award for having gone 6 weeks without a major accident. And this happened on the 5th week. And so the squadron commander was seriously upset because I took his opportunity away to get the flying safety award when he crashed one of his airplanes. And from that point forward, he and I never got along. So for the next several days, I was seriously in the doghouse. And finally, the accident investigators came back in and said, well, it wasn't your fault. It was a problem with the airspeed indicator and altitude indicator and all of that. But by that time, the damage had been done. So the operations officer, which was the number 2 guy in command, came up to me and said, it might be a good idea for you to get out of Dodge City for a while. And about that time, we got a classified assignment to we didn't know where, but it was to leave the Air Force and go to work for the Central Intelligence Agency for a while and, sort of try to figure out what that was all about. Anyway, so in order to get out of Masala and out from underneath the squadron commander, who, by the way, got killed shortly after that. So if I had hung around, it probably would have been all right. But anyway, so I volunteered for the assignment, went down to Tokyo, got discharged from the Air Force, got a civilian passport, and put on my civilian clothes and headed down to the Philippine Islands and went to work for a company, faux company, if you will, that was a Central Intelligence Agency, and it spent 6 months or so over a bit. I've always thought that the name of the company was really kind of funny. It was something like, and I'm not sure exactly, the American Botanical Survey Corporation. And I always thought, how apt, that because you're going to spend the next 6 months in the jungle working out of the jungle. So you're going to get to spend a lot of time with botanicals.
Yeah, that's quite a credible name, I guess. And what was your role there? What were you doing?
So when they got you down there, the idea was to try to convince the Vietnamese army or, train the Vietnamese army in the use of air power. But to do it at the time, at the beginning, there was no way to train them because you were always operating on the ground. So I happened to be assigned to a Vietnamese army division, and part of that division was a ranger, battalion, let's say, few hundred. And I was assigned to it as a ground forward air controller. So what would happen is I would be embedded with the ground troops, and so whenever they went on some sort of what would you call it, mission, why I'd be with them, and I had a Vietnamese radio man. So if we needed or wanted air support, I could call in fighter aircraft to put in an attack against the enemy in the engagement, or maybe try to arrange helicopters for the wounded, things like that. So anyway, so you become kind of an infantry officer of sorts. And I did that for a little while. And then for whatever reason, they decided that that was not as effective as if you were an airborne forward air controller. And they were right about that. Being airborne allows you, first of all, to get a better look at what's going on, and second of all, to be able to mark the target better with the smoke and stuff like that. So after, kind of a relatively short stint with the infantry, then I went off and went to work and got embedded with a Vietnamese, if you will, reconnaissance squadron.
I think with your ground combat unit, you have a bit of a challenge with the first helicopter insertion.
Yes, that was funny. So my training background was, go watch all the John Wayne movies that you can and get and figure out what, or watch World War II movies and figure out what the combat's all about. I'd only been I'd only been in the country a few days, and so I was up in the northern part of the country, and the idea was that ranger outfit that I was assigned to was going to go in on a skirmish with a fairly significant force of Viet Cong, and so I was going to be their ground controller. And I got all dressed up in my jungle suit and with guns and knives and hand grenades and all kinds of things that you'd expect. And a Marine commander and a Marine helicopter, American Marine helicopter unit that the agency was using, I came up and briefed us the night before and told us going in that we expected 10% casualties before we went in. And I was assigned to go in with the chopper and about 8 or 10 Vietnamese Rangers in the back. And the Marine gunnery sergeant or whatever came up to me and he said, "Now listen, we haven't yet. We know you haven't done this before, but typically the landing zones are hot entries where we're going to be taking fire. So when we land, we want you to get off instantaneously and run towards the enemy forces, which we were going to land in elephant grass, and then the bad guys were supposed to be inside the jungle, just on the edge of the clearing." And he said, "Now, whatever you do, get off in a hurry. When I tap you on the shoulder, out you go." Well, by this time, the adrenaline is rushing through, and I have about 4 quarts of adrenaline running at about 100 miles an hour through my system. I think I often think, if we'd been flying at, let's say, 1,000 feet, and he had tapped me on the shoulder for some reason, I'd have jumped the airplane. So, anyway, so we land. He taps me on the shoulder, and I got off, and people are shooting and carrying on, and I'm shooting back and carrying on, and I only got about 10, 15 yards, and it occurred to me that there was nobody behind me, and so I turned around and thought, nobody else got off the chopper except me. And I was afraid that they were going to take off and leave me there. So I turned around and I started running back to the chopper, probably much faster than I left. And about the time I was almost within, touching distance of the chopper, why, out comes the other 8 or so guys. And if they were going one way, I was going the other way. By the time I turned around and got back, I was kind of deflated and pulling up the rear, and when we finally got into the tree line. But the Marines, I think, thought that was the funniest thing that they'd seen in a long period of time. So after they picked us up a couple of days later, why, it was hours in their area drinking beer, and at the first time they had a big ceremony, and they gave me a sword, cardboard or wooden or whatever, so that I could lead charges into that young laughter. But that was my first experience. It was a very, very steep learning curve on that thing.
So the aircraft that you're flying as the forward air controller is not an aircraft you're familiar with. Would that be correct?
Yeah. So the aircraft was like a small civilian prop type airplane that you'd see around our airfields, and probably airspeed wise, it was maybe 100, 125 miles an hour. Easy to fly. And it's a type that a lot of private pilots would be flying. When they went out looking for volunteers, I guess, volunteers might be the right word. Anyway, there was only 5 of us in the northern third of the country that were eligible, and so I not only volunteered to go into it, but I was probably I wouldn't say I lied about my experience, but I think that they probably misunderstood the level of my experience when they accepted me in. And my experience with those kinds of airplanes was very, very limited because when I went through flight school, I flew a prop airplane, much more sophisticated than that one, for about probably 2 dozen rides. Once I soloed after about the, I don't know, sixth, seventh, eighth ride, well, you did a few beyond that, and then you transitioned directly into small jet trainers. So I really had a little bit of prop experience, but then when I volunteered for that, why it was sort of like checking out to learn how to be a private pilot again. And as you know, my checkout ride was something less than impressive. Um, but it was very humorous. But it was the kind of airplane, if you're an experienced pilot, you could probably teach yourself how to fly without, having too much problems.
From what I remember reading it, it was sort of on the job training. You had a guy in the back sort of giving you some instructions, but not a huge amount of help.
Yeah. So the deal is that because you're an advisor, you had to have a Vietnamese officer commanding the aircraft. So typically it would be a young Vietnamese second lieutenant or ensign or whatever you called him. But he was not a pilot and he had no flight experience, but he was a Vietnamese officer. And so therefore he was in the back seat commanding the aircraft, and the American was in the front seat flying the aircraft. Because of the nature of the aircraft, in order to mark the target for the fighters that were going to be attacking the target, he was supposed to, and in many cases did. We would fly over the top of the target at, let's say, 50 feet. And the guy in the back would open up the windows on the side and he'd have a case of smoke grenades and he'd pull a smoke grenade out, pull the pin, throw the smoke grenade out. And when it hit the ground, it exploded, gave off smoke, and then that would mark the target for the fighters overhead. It also had a secondary advantage in that even if we didn't have fighters overhead, if we marked the target a couple of times, the people on the ground tended to think that there were fighters overhead and they would break camp and leave and go someplace else. But the deal was his job purely and simply was to, throw a hand grenade out the side window to mark the thing. And so the issue I had after a number of fights is they put a new, whatever you call, commander in the back. And this particular guy was afraid of heights. And so he couldn't bring himself to open up the window or to lean over to that side and then, throw hand grenades out the side window because, every time he opened a window and looked out, it bothered him greatly. So on our first trip together, he couldn't bring himself to look out the window to drop the smoke grenades. And we went around over and over again and finally reached a point where there's, every time you fly over the top of them, of course, they're shooting at you. And we must have made 2 or 3 circles around the target. And finally, this guy decides that, okay, he can lean way off to the other side of the seat and just throw the hand grenade out the open window. But when he did that, he missed the window and the grenade landed on the seat. And so you have about, I don't know, 6 to 8 seconds or something like that before it goes off. So during that time, he finally picked up the grenade and got it out the window. And during that time, I talked to him about my personal feelings about him and his relatives, his heritage, anybody he'd ever met, where he went to school, who else lived in his neighborhood. Didn't matter. And I covered the whole gamut. And unfortunately, while he didn't speak English, he was able to sort of get the gist of the conversation. So he lost a lot of face. And so when he got on the ground, or when we got on the ground, there was a big hullabaloo because I'd insulted him and all his family, which is true. I don't think I missed anybody. And but it turns out he was related to the president of the country, like a I don't know, nephew or something. And that meant that the president also lost face, which was probably true. But anyway, so he complained and I got fired. And so my flying career with the Vietnamese Air Force was over and I got reassigned to an American Special Operations Force. I think they thought it was a better personality match or something.
Brilliant. And I think with this Special Operations Force, so you're back on the ground again in the combat zone, and you're working with a South Vietnamese Special Forces unit as well, and they are very brutal when it comes to their interrogation techniques.
Yes. So the arrangement I had was an odd one. So because I was working, because after the incident with the Vietnamese Air Force, I was persona non grata, and one of the options was to throw me out of the country. And obviously that wasn't a good career move. So I went down to talk to my boss with the agency, and he allowed us how he would attach me to an American Special Forces team, American Army Special Forces team. And they were a 12-man team of highly trained and experienced guys. And I would be the oddball 13th guy attached to him to help out and pitch him wherever I could be useful. And the job was to sort of pacify a section of the country up in the very northwest corner, up along on the border of Laos and the border of South Vietnam, and interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail to some extent to pacify the area. And then, in addition to that, we wanted to build a Montagnard village.
The Montagnards is an umbrella term for the various indigenous peoples in the central highlands of Vietnam. It's a French term signifying a mountain dweller.
And build a striker team of Montagnards. And so part of the issue was to build a village in conjunction with the small camp. So on one occasion, during that period of time, the South Vietnamese army decided that they needed to put a small South Vietnamese special operations team along with our team in the village and to try to work together. The problem was that the South Vietnamese did not care for the Montagnard. They felt that they were, animals and beneath them. And of course, the Montagnards didn't care for the South Vietnamese. So, but while we were there, the commander, operation commander, was a South Vietnamese captain and had a background where he was coming out of North Vietnam during that period. I can't remember the dates right now, but there was a period where they opened up the boundary between North Vietnam and South and allowed those North Vietnamese families that wanted to, perhaps that were of Catholic religion, to come south and resettle in South Vietnam. And he and his family were doing that. They got stopped and arrested at the border, and he was tortured, and his family and his wife were all. His wife was raped, and his family was all killed. And then they released him, and so he was. By the time he got back into South Vietnam, he was, living on the get even train. So he then, because remember we were just advisors, so if we had somebody, he was in charge of the interrogations, and that was a pretty cruel operation. Typically ended up with the shooting a prisoner anyway. So, but yeah, so that was more of a hindrance to our operation than helpful. But it gave you a really interesting insight into the depth of hatred between many of the people in the north and in the south and the people in the north.
You describe one incident where you recapture a village and the North Vietnamese have mutilated the headman's 5-year-old daughter, but you have to go out and find her. Yeah.
So for me, that was literally a life-changing experience. I suppose like most of us, I wasn't prepared, for the, for the level of what terrorism and atrocities and torture and things like that went on. But in this one particular case, they had taken the headman's young daughter, who I happen to have a daughter about her same age. And the Viet Cong team that was coming through had taken a machete and cut the fingers off both hands with a machete. And then they threw her in the middle of a rice paddy to, I don't know, bleed to death and die or whatever. And so when we took the village back, my headman kind of was totally unglued and was telling us about what had taken place. And we went out into the rice paddy to pick up this little girl and bring it back to her father. And the level of cruelty I had not been prepared for. But at that particular time, why I decided that I wanted to make the rest of my career focused on counterinsurgency and trying to do my best to eliminate people who would do something like that to a young girl. I know warfare is difficult, and I know it's tough, and I know it's bloody, but there are human limits to what should be done. And certainly, you don't advance the war very much by torturing to death young 5-year-old girls. I mean, so I decided that from that point forward that my career would kind of revolve around the idea of, okay, let's go get even and let's try as best we can to eliminate people who would do that kind of thing. So that was a huge deal for me and my wife, and I never quite got over it. And for all the years after that, when you're really having a bad dream, why, that's one of them.
Robert, I really appreciate you sharing that and telling me about the brutality of the Vietnam War, and share how those events affected you personally. You decide to leave the CIA quite shortly after that, and you go back to your squadron.
Yeah, it was only a month or two after that. The arrangement is that after you put in a full tour, which was thought to be about 6 months, give or take, but after your tour's up, well, then you get reinstated back into the Air Force if you choose to. You get reinstated back into the Air Force, back in your rank, and back to your unit, and so forth. So when it was time to go home, or time for them to send you home, you went through an interview process where agency would interview you to try to see if you would like to stay with them, or the Air America operation with them, or the Air Commando operation with the Air Force. But in my case, I felt, at least at the time, that the best option was for me to go back and get back into a fighter squadron, because the war was moving forward, and I thought that would get me back in the action better at that. So it was a pretty routine thing. I think we had a couple of friends that went with the Air America operation because the money was very, very good. And I think the majority probably went back into the Air Force.
You rejoined your squadron in Japan. Was it a similar mission profile to what you were doing before, or was it different?
No, and that's a really good point. So it was sort of, all of a sudden you're coming out of a jungle, and 3 or 4 days or a week later, you're back in your squadron, but you're back into a nuclear mission. Hard to make that transition. First of all, because once you had that experience, you could see what was going on around the world. The entire world was going through a transition where you saw insurgencies anywhere from Greece to Indonesia to wherever, and countries like the United States, the UK, France, they were all faced with insurgencies in their relationships and previous colonies and stuff like that. And it was clear that the strategy for the Soviet Union was proxy wars. So the nuclear thing was almost like a hiding space for the Air Force, and it was a follow through on World War II. You remember about that time, the militaries, or at least most of the militaries, the leadership was almost all successful World War II participants. And World War II, at least for the Americans at the time, was focused on success in Europe. Obviously, there was a strong part of that success was in the Pacific, but the leadership typically didn't come out of the Pacific forces. It came out of the people who were successful in Europe at the time. And so the nuclear mission was kind of easy way to hide out and not recognize what was taking place throughout the world. Fortunately, President Kennedy had a little broader view of the world, but when he got shot, it sort of, with President Johnson, it ended up back with much of the same. Now, the problem with that was that when you do that to a military unit, you altered fairly dramatically your training profile for that unit. So to use an example, so let's suppose you have an hour of training during that mission. Well, in most cases with the nuclear mission, you spend probably 45 minutes, practicing nuclear deliveries and low-level, high-speed attacks. And that eliminated the training in the conventional mission and in the air-to-air mission. Now, the problem is that's what you're going to go fight. So while worst case may be the nuclear situation, the most likely case was obviously the proxy wars that were going on all around the world. Our leadership just couldn't pivot. They couldn't get out of World War II in Europe. And so as a result, the training time was frittered away on the wrong mission. And then, as you would expect, if the real mission comes along a little bit later, but you you've wasted all of those important hours. My argument with that is that, not that it's uncommon, but my argument is that, you have to be able to look around and say, well, what's my most probable, outcome here? I mean, if I'm going to prepare to fight, what's my most likely fight? And unfortunately, we didn't do that. About a year later, I guess 63-ish probably, they began to convert from less emphasis on nuke and more emphasis on conventional warfare. And finally, they went full over and the training program. But by that time, we'd lost quite a bit. And very shortly thereafter, we ended up going back into Southeast Asia with the unit to fight over there. And, obviously, once we got there, then your entire military structure, from command on down to the operators, is focused on nuclear. And so you not only have people on the operator level that are, if you will, poorly trained in what you're going to have to do, but the same thing occurs to the leadership. So you not only have poorly trained people, but you also have poorly trained leaders. And so I believe that the early moments in Vietnam probably cost us a lot of people, simply because it's not that they weren't good, it's just they were improperly trained for the occasion.
Yeah, because the mission profile now is ground attack.
Yeah.
And the war in Vietnam is hotting up. So I think in 1964, you're preparing for combat in Vietnam. I mean, are you married at this point?
Yes. So I was married with two of my children. I now have, I ended up with three, but at the time I was married with two children. And from the period 62 through the end of my third tour in the beginning of 67, during that roughly 5-year period of time, I was gone almost all the time. I mean, I think my wife and I figured out that during that period of time, I was gone about 10 and a half months a year every year. Wow. And most of that was, so let's say I got back to my unit in roughly 1963, went back to flying. 64, we were redeployed back over to Southeast Asia, prepping for the war. First strike started in early 65, went on the first strikes, and then we got pulled back probably spring, summer of 65, rebuilt, and then went back over and flew on my third tour through 66 to the beginning of 67. So it was a 5-year period where you were either in combat, coming back for a little repair and renovation, and then back over to combat. So that during that 5-year period.
Can you tell me about your little trip to China?
Oh, yeah. That was really neat. So we're on the first strikes up in North Vietnam. And the deal was, I was leading a flight doing what we refer to as MIGCAP, which is simply acting as a barrier between the MiG air bases and the bomber, the strike aircraft they're putting in, and you put an air-to-air unit in as a barrier. And so I was running the barrier, and lo and behold, a couple of MiGs jump out of the MiG base below. And I don't know why they did it, because the bases were a sanctuary. We weren't allowed to attack the bases, so they didn't have to get airborne. But anyway, they did. So two of them jump off. I have a flight of 4. Yeah, flight of 4. And so the one MiG takes off, heads west-northwest, and the other guy heads east-northeast. I jumped a guy heading northeast. And all I could think of was getting one of the first kills of the war. And so I'm chasing the guy, and he's running as fast as he can, and I'm going as fast as I can, or we can, I should say. And when and there's no way to find out when you're crossing into China from Vietnam, because it's not like there's street signs or anything like that. No rest stations or anything. So he runs into China, and I'm hot on his tail, and I just can't close enough to get a missile shot at him. And he's running, I'm running. It, 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 I realize we're in China when the Chinese start shooting at us. So everybody above the age of 6 in China was shooting at us, and not only that, but I didn't want to use the afterburner because we were running too short on fuel. So I chased the guy up, and the next thing I know, the radio explodes, and everybody in the world is upset because I am causing an international incident, and and so to make a long story short, I guess the American government's all upset, the Chinese government's all upset, the North Vietnamese government, the South Vietnamese government's all upset. So we do the fastest 180-degree turn in history of aviation and head south to get out over the water. Once we got out over the water, of course, the shooting stops, and that was a good thing. But we didn't have enough gas to get back to our recovery base. So I had to talk a refueling tanker into coming up into the Gulf, Tonkin Gulf, to refuel us earlier. And by the time we rendezvoused with the tanker and got onto the tanker, we probably had about 4 or 5 minutes of flying time left before we flamed out. And then got hooked up and transitioned through, cycled through the tanker, and then came back to land at Da Nang. And as we're walking in, we decided that we probably shouldn't say anything about where we were and what had taken place and all that, hoping that maybe everybody would forget about it and life would go on in a happier state. So it was really exciting. I learned that I have to, control my boyish enthusiasm sometimes and not run out of gas on China and not intrude on China where people, were not very welcome and very, certainly not very hospitable, I didn't think. So anyway, but I think that may have been one of the first, penetrations of Chinese airspace of the war.
Yeah. Yeah, you appear to always be starting international incidents. What with the nephew of the South Vietnamese president and flying into China. Can you take me through November the 24th, 1964?
Is that one that got shot down?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You would think I'd remember that. Yeah, but anyway, so that was quite an experience. So the arrangement we had back then, our squadron was stationed in the Philippine Islands in northern Luzon, and we had a small contingent up in Taiwan sitting nuclear as sort of a deterrent for the Chinese in the event that they wanted to sort of become aggressive. We had sort of a depot R&R contingent, about a quarter of the squadron in Clark Air Base in the Philippine Islands, and then the other half of the squadron were deployed over to South Vietnam to Da Nang for the first strikes up in North Vietnam. The arrangement was you can't strike North Vietnam from the Philippine Islands because the Philippine Islands was a neutral country. And they didn't want to end up stuck in the problem of they were supporting American, aircraft for the war. And so so we would typically fly out of the Philippine Islands over to South Vietnam, turn the birds, arm them up, and then head north into North Vietnam. That way, that gave the Philippine Islands neutrality. And they were very, very sensitive about that, and understandably so. But anyway, so this one morning, I was heading on over to Vietnam, and as I was taking you off, and just as I, broke ground, reaching for the gear handle and all, I got hit really hard. The bad guys had set up what we referred to as ESUs, which was a anti-aircraft gun. It was sort of like a quad 50 caliber machine gun, and they set up one or two of them on the end of the runway that we're taking off on.
The bad guys that Robert is referring to are Philippine communist insurgents.
And so I was about 30, 40 feet in the air when I got hit really hard by those. The aircraft exploded and the cockpit filled with fire. And so you're sitting in fire and you're trying to figure out what just happened. And I pulled up to the right, and about the time I got up around 1,000 feet, which was a couple of seconds, why I got another explosion. But once again, the cockpit fills with fire, and it's a weird experience. First of all, you're almost punchy because you all this has happened to you in probably 20 or 30 seconds, and it takes a bit to get your wits about you. But the other thing is it's like sitting in the center of a bonfire. You're literally sitting in a fire. Any skin exposed is burning. You can feel any metal parts melting into your skin, and it's hard to see out, of course, because the entire cockpit is engulfed in flame. And I got up to maybe 1,500 feet, something like that, and then began to lose power. But the problem I had was that I was over at that point the city of Angeles, and if I had punched out, which is obviously what you should have done, if I had, the bird would have landed in the middle of a city and killed many innocent people. And so I was trying to get it out over a clearing that was elephant grass, and that steered away from the city. And then as I was just getting it out over there, I got the third explosion, and the same thing, but this time the third explosion, eliminated the flight control system. So I had no control over the aircraft, and it rolled over and went nose down towards the ground. And so when I finally punched out. The aircraft went into the jungle, which was good. My problem was I got out too low, pointed down, and so the chute didn't open. Didn't have time to open. But fortunately, I hit into a small jumble stream in the stream for a few seconds, and I went into the stream literally up to my chin, and the stream was about 10 or 15 feet wide. So I pride myself on being able to hit a 10 or 15 foot wide target from 800 feet, which I thought was pretty good considering you didn't have a parachute. and I hit pretty hard, but when I was in the stream, I happened to hit into where there were a group of snakes around, and so the snakes were bumping into my face, and obviously I needed to get out of there. So I climbed up to the bank, got into the elephant grass, and about that time I looked, and there was quite a few, half a dozen the guys coming at me with AK automatic weapons, and so the routine for them is that the first thing they have to do is they throw a cordon around you, and then they begin to squeeze the cordon until they finally have you in the loop. And so I needed to get through them in order to get to an Army chopper that had just seen what was going on and landed over at the tree line, and which was, let's say, 100 yards away or something like that. And so I needed to get through the bad guys in order to get to the chopper, because that was my only way out. Otherwise, they pick you up, take you prisoner, torture you for a day or two, and then kill you. So I shot a couple of those guys. That made a hole in the cord, and I went through the grass, got to the chopper, and got a ride to the hospital. The difficulty, which I didn't know at the time, was that my back had been broken in 3 places, as well as a pelvic area, and I screwed up both shoulders and things like that. So I was kind of screwed up. And then, but anyway, I made it to the chopper and I got a ride out to the hospital.
Wow. Well, that's an incredible story. That when I read it in the book, I thought, God, you're so lucky to hit the stream and get out of that situation, and to be shot down over a neutral country. That's probably pretty much a first as well.
Yeah.
So you recover from your injuries and continue to fly, and you're involved in these ground attack missions right the way through to the end of the Vietnam War. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes I'm asked, you know, why would you do that? Right. I mean, because one of the obvious questions is that, obviously you don't have to. So you can't be very smart if you would do it again. Sort of like putting your hand on a hot stove. So anyway, but one of the issues I had was, first of all, I thought I was doing the right thing. Second of all, I really kind of felt like I owed them one. I got pretty well beat up by those guys, and I sort of thought, it would be a good idea not to let them get away with that, but to get back into business. So I did. I flew the first missions into North Vietnam, bombing missions into North Vietnam for a while. After I finished that tour, I got back, and obviously my injuries were bothering more and more, and I reached the point where I couldn't walk anymore. I was in a wheelchair. And the Air Force sent me off to a hospital where I spent quite a few months and got rehabbed, and then was able to work my way to where I could physically get back on flight status. So I did, and that brought me back into my third tour. And that tour was a very, very good tour, very rewarding. I probably not supposed to talk about combat that way, but but for me it was very, very rewarding because you were working with American troops on the ground that were in trouble of one kind or another, and in the fight with them, helping to reach a good outcome. Then at the end of the third tour in 1967, the war was really just getting going. And I'd already had 3 tours. And so the rules that the Air Force put down was that I couldn't go back for a 4th tour, and I wanted to go back. And so rule was I had to have 5 years out of combat before I could go back. And combat lasted long enough to where I spent the first 3 years training combat tactics in our advanced school, and then went over to the Middle East for 2.5 years and worked over there. And the tour in the Middle East was really an interesting tour, and I really got a lot out of it. And one of the things I got out of it is, that was the beginning of Middle Eastern terrorism with the Black September group cranking up and all kinds of things going on in Beirut and Syria, the Soviet Union, things like that. And so when you first saw it, if you were in the military business, you would have said to yourself, I better pay close attention because this thing is getting worse instead of better. And one of these days, you're going to end up back here, working back here again. And so it was very useful for me to study what was going on and spend time studying with the people. So, for example, going over there, one of the things I did was I studied the Quran for a while, because it's very, very difficult for at least Americans to comprehend the logic sequence for the Arab culture or the Islamic culture. But knowing that you're going to end up working back there, why, it was a good 2.5 years. So it was well spent, and I got a tremendous education because, as part of my job, we also ran the operation over there, and because that was the most forward operating base for the United States in the Middle East. It was on the very eastern corner of Turkey, about 25 miles across the water from Cyprus. So then, but once I did that, then that got me like 5 years out of the war, and I was able to go directly from Turkey back over to Southeast Asia to command a fighting unit as my last tour. And during that tour, I had the honor of flying what I think was the last combat mission of the war out of Cambodia. So that was, yeah, kind of more cool on another.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you described that last mission in the book. Now, you know the truce starts at noon. You're flying that last combat mission. Well, what's going through your head at that point?
That was a big question for me, because obviously you're commanding, right? So we were scheduled for a 3-ship down into was to be a pretty hot target down in Cambodia. And one of the issues with flying out of Cambodia is that we didn't have a good rescue operation, and if you were shot down, the Cambodians picked you up, well, you'd be tortured and killed. So that was a done deal. As a commander, my problem was I was afraid that some of the less experienced guys would say, this is my last chance to be a hero and last chance to get my name in the newspaper or whatever it was that you want to have. And they would end up being shot down. And I would end up having to write letters to their families and wives and mothers. And I was losing sleep about that. And so I decided that I would pick me and 2 other guys that had 2 tours, or at least 1 tour behind them, so that they were kind of old hands at the combat thing. And after you've had a lot of combat time, you get hard to kill is the advantage. And so I'm sure that the younger guys that were running around with their hair on fire were probably mad at me for not choosing them to go on a ride with them. But the one thing I wanted to do was take 3 guys down there and take 3 guys back. And so 3 of us went down there, worked over a target. It was a very, very good target. It was certainly rewarding, if you will. But we're coming out of Cambodia. We hit our post-strike tankers, topped off, and as we're heading back home, it's 12 o'clock on radio. Saigon says that it's a truce, the war's over, and it was a really spooky feeling. I thought, I just spent 12, 13 years of my life in or out of the war, getting ready for the war or whatever, and all of a sudden it's over, and it's almost like you think, well, God, what do we do now? Yeah. And so, but the 3 of us were cruising back at about 25, 30,000 feet, something like that, back home, and it was just this weird feeling that all of a sudden, all your experiences are behind you. So
you are awarded the Silver Star.
right.
What was the citation with that award?
What happened is that the Army wrote me up for the award. The Army put me in for the Silver Star, and I was credited with a killing of over 1,500 enemy troops, destroying 8 anti-aircraft gun positions, and essentially breaking the back of the invasion, and the North Vietnamese in a retreat and in a panic-like retreat. And so the Army was real excited because I saved the lives of several hundred American troopers that were being overrun. And the problem is, the airplane was just shot to pieces. There was nothing left of the airplane. So I had violated 5 different Air Force regulations during the process, which I happen to think at the time was a good idea. The Air Force did not agree with me. It was a good idea because when I landed their airplane, they bulldozed it off the runway and, just trashed it. I ended up being held under arrest in my tent, attending court-martial. And fortunately, an Army general flew in from the site and got the Air Force to drop charges and got the Army to award me a Silver Star. So I was happy because I'd already admitted to all the attorneys that I had violated all those rules and regulations, and so me losing out on a court-martial was probably a done deal. So I was happy I got out of jail when they gave me a Silver Star.
Colonel Graham's book is called One of the Few, a true account of courage and stepping into the fight. There are links in the episode information. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and look forward to seeing you next week.